Usually when we think about international trade, we imagine it as this highly bureaucratic, slow-moving machine.
Right.
It's like a quiet neighborhood where everyone agreed on the property lines 50 years ago. You borrow a cup of sugar, they borrow your lawnmower, and well, while there might be occasional bickering over a fence, it is all very polite.
Exactly. It's bound by rules, these massive multilateral treaties, and a baseline expectation of mutual stability.
Decades of supply chains have been built on the assumption that those property lines aren't just going to suddenly move.
Yeah, but imagine you wake up one morning, you look out the window, and your neighbor hasn't just moved the property line. They've built a 50-foot concrete wall right through your backyard.
Oh, man.
And they're demanding to know who else you're friends with in town, essentially declaring that your house is now an extension of theirs.
Right.
Suddenly, that polite neighborhood is a war zone. It is the absolute definition of a systemic shock. The foundational rules that govern the relationship are just gone overnight. And that, well, it forces a completely different kind of survival strategy.
And that systemic shock is exactly what we are looking at today. We are doing a deep dive into the unprecedented historic collapse of U.S.-Canada trade relations.
It's a huge topic.
Yeah, it really is. And we have a mountain of material we are synthesizing for this. We've got international news reports, deep macroeconomic data from think tanks at UChicago and Harvard Kennedy School, analyses from RBC Economics, and official government fact sheets from both sides of the border.
And it really requires pulling from all those different disciplines, diplomacy, macroeconomics, logistics, because we are watching a real-time stress test of a highly integrated cross-border supply chain that took generations to build.
The mission for this deep dive is clear. We want to unpack the actual mechanics of this crisis. We're going to look at the economic math behind Donald Trump's historic 50% tariffs. And more importantly, we want to explore how Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is using this exact crisis to execute a massive structural middle power decoupling.
Which, if successful, it represents a fundamental shift in how global economics operate. It challenges the assumption that geography dictates destiny.
Okay, let's unpack this. The immediate surface-level catalyst here is the sudden escalation of economic hostilities. The United States placed 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods.
Right.
And Canada immediately fired back with dollar-for-dollar retaliation. But to understand the underlying economics, we have to start with the diplomatic explosion that set this all off. These countries were in negotiations. Why did talks fail at the absolute 11th hour?
Well, the breakdown was incredibly dramatic, mostly because of the nature of the demands introduced at the very end. The negotiations collapsed because the U.S. introduced stipulations that went far beyond traditional tariff schedules or quota limits. They demanded fundamental restrictions on Canada's sovereign ability to negotiate future trade agreements with other countries.
So going back to the neighborhood metaphor, the U.S. was basically saying, if you want to maintain a deal with us, you can't go make deals with anyone else in the world without our explicit permission.
Yeah, exactly.
That fundamentally crosses the line from trade policy into dictating foreign policy.
Essentially, yes. It was a demand for economic exclusivity. And it didn't stop at international borders. It reached directly into domestic policy.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The U.S. negotiators also targeted Canadian cultural sovereignty. They specifically demanded changes to domestic policies that protect the French language and Quebec's cultural industries.
Oh, wow. Which is always a massive third rail in Canadian politics. I mean, you don't touch Quebec's cultural protections unless you want the entire country to erupt.
Exactly. From the Canadian perspective, this crossed a massive red line. Prime Minister Carney pulled his negotiators entirely.
Right.
And his messaging was incredibly blunt, especially for a Canadian leader. He called the U.S. demands a deliberate power play and an unacceptable attack on national sovereignty.
Yeah.
He stated that American signature was written in pencil. And most striking of all, he said, "You are at war when you get attacked."
Written in pencil is such a potent phrase. He's not just saying this specific deal is bad. He's communicating to the rest of the world that the United States is no longer a reliable partner. He's saying that any treaty signed by the U.S. can be erased the moment a new administration takes power, or even on a whim. That is a devastating critique of U.S. diplomatic credibility.
It really is.
Yeah.
But if we are going to understand this conflict fully, we have to impartially look at the White House's justification.
Right.
The U.S. administration didn't just wake up and decide to dynamite the relationship for no reason. There is a specific legal, political and economic rationale they are operating under, rooted in domestic American frustrations.
Right, because if you're the U.S. Trade Representative, Jamieson Greer, you have a very different narrative.
Exactly.
The Trump administration utilized Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. Just conceptually, reaching back to a law from 1930 to justify trade actions in the 2020s is fascinating.
It is.
It gives the president the authority to impose duties on countries deemed to be actively discriminating against U.S. commerce. So what is the actual U.S. grievance here? What are they claiming Canada did?
Well, the White House laid out a number of specific, long-standing complaints where they feel Canada has been playing an unfair game. One of the major historical grievances involves Canadian dairy quotas.
Canada has a system called supply management for dairy, right? Like, they strictly control how much milk is produced domestically to keep prices stable for their farmers.
Correct. And to protect that domestic system, they heavily restrict imports.
Right.
The U.S. argues that Canada's protectionist dairy system unfairly shuts out U.S. cheese, while simultaneously giving preferential treatment to European Union cheese. Canada has trade agreements with both the U.S. and the EU, but the U.S. claims the quotas are structured to discriminate against American dairy farmers.
Okay, so dairy is a big one. What else?
The U.S. also pointed to Canadian quotas that they claim essentially strong-arm American auto companies into manufacturing inside Canada rather than in the U.S., which they view as siphoning off American capital and investment.
Interesting.
Furthermore, they highlighted a very specific issue where almost all Canadian provinces had suddenly halted the purchase and distribution of U.S. alcoholic beverages through their state-controlled liquor boards.
Wow.
Yeah, and they did this without imposing those same restrictions on beverages from other countries.
So from the USTR's perspective, Canada was actively backing away from previous commitments, playing favorites, and using bureaucratic loopholes to block American goods. And President Trump's public messaging on this took those technical trade grievances and turned them into massive political theater. He tweeted that Canada wants the benefits of being a 51st state without actually being one.
Yeah.
He even went so far as to sign an executive order attempting to rename Lake Ontario to Lake America.
I know.
Which is frankly absurd, but it reveals the strategy. He's trying to establish a narrative of complete American dominance, but how does a sovereign nation even respond to that? Like, you can't just ignore a 50% tariff, but you also can't negotiate with someone renaming your lakes.
This raises an important question.
Yeah.
How do we separate that political theater, the tweets, the lake renaming, from the actual macroeconomic reality of the policies being implemented?
Right.
Because the political goals stated by the Trump administration are very clear. Protect American jobs, reshore manufacturing, protect national security, and ultimately replace the federal income tax with tariff revenue.
That's a huge claim.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the mechanics of how tariffs actually function in the real-world economy often tell a very different story than the political messaging.
Let's dive deep into that real-world story, because the economic math here is crucial. To achieve those goals, the Trump administration pushed the average effective U.S. tariff rate from 2.5% all the way up to an estimated 27% before the Supreme Court eventually intervened and the dust settled at an effective rate of 12.1%.
Right.
Now, the core political argument for tariffs is almost always about saving domestic manufacturing jobs. But there's a massive structural reality that the Harvard Kennedy School data points out. Manufacturing only employs about 8% of Americans today.
And that is the foundational disconnect.
Yeah.
The political messaging appeals to a deep nostalgia for a mid-20th century economy where half the country worked on an assembly line.
Yeah.
But that economy simply doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't been offshored as much as it has been automated away or shifted entirely into the service sector.
Right.
But the really critical concept here, and the reason tariffs often backfire on the country imposing them, is what economists call the input-output multiplier.
Yes, the input-output multiplier. This is the concept that really breaks the illusion of tariffs acting as a simple shield. I want to try explaining this because it blew my mind when I was reading the UChicago data.
Go for it.
So, let's use steel as the classic example. The government says we want to protect American steel workers, so they place a massive tariff on imported foreign steel.
Mm-hmm.
In a vacuum, this works for the primary steel producer. The domestic steel mill can suddenly compete because the foreign steel is artificially expensive. They might even hire a few thousand more workers.
Right.
But the problem is nobody goes to the store to buy a raw slab of steel. Steel is an input. It's an ingredient.
Precisely. It is a raw material that feeds into thousands of other industries.
Right. So think about a factory in Ohio that makes washing machines, or a company making construction equipment. Their primary ingredients, steel, just skyrocketed in price. Their production costs go through the roof. To survive, they have to raise the price of their washing machines. When the price of a washing machine goes up, consumers buy fewer of them. When sales drop, the washing machine factory has to lay off workers.
And the UChicago data quantifies exactly how punishing that cycle is. Their models show that for every one manufacturing job saved in primary steel production, roughly 60 to 80 jobs are lost in those downstream steel-consuming industries. Their margins are wiped out.
So what does this all mean when we look at the actual scoreboard? The administration rolled out what they called the Liberation Day tariffs, which applied a baseline 10% tariff globally on everything, not just Canada.
Right.
And the data is stark. Within just 10 months, the U.S. economy actually lost 89,000 manufacturing jobs and another 124,000 transportation and warehousing jobs.
That is the input-output multiplier functioning exactly as economic theory predicts. It acts as an immense drag on the broader economy, and it ripples outward. Corporate bankruptcies hit their highest level since 2010. The U.S. Consumer Sentiment Index plummeted to a record low, and fundamentally we have to understand that tariffs act as a regressive tax on domestic consumers, not a penalty paid by a foreign government.
This is a huge misconception that gets repeated endlessly. The foreign company, let's say a Canadian lumber mill, does not write a check to the U.S. Treasury.
Never. The U.S. importer, the American company buying the lumber, pays the tariff to U.S. Customs at the border.
Right.
What does that American company do? They pass that cost directly onto the American home buyer building a new house. The Tax Foundation data estimated that these tariffs increased costs by an average of $840 per U.S. household in 2026.
Which totally dismantles the idea that you could replace the federal income tax with tariff revenue. I mean, if tariffs are just a tax on domestic consumption, you're just shifting the tax burden from income to the checkout aisle while simultaneously causing massive inflation and wiping out downstream manufacturing jobs.
Exactly. Over the long term, the economic models project a 0.4% reduction in U.S. GDP and a reduction in the national capital stock.
Wow.
Tariffs fail to stimulate overall growth because they distort the market, raise costs for everyone, and siphon money out of the pockets of everyday consumers. When consumers have less disposable income because everything costs more, overall demand in the economy shrinks.
Okay, so the U.S. is experiencing massive internal economic friction from its own policies, shooting itself in the foot to save a toe.
Yeah.
But Canada didn't just sit back and watch the U.S. struggle. They launched a massive counterstrike. And for a country internationally stereotyped for being unfailingly polite, their response was incredibly surgical, calculated, and frankly, ruthless.
It was far from polite. It was a masterclass in asymmetric economic warfare. Canada announced $27.6 billion in counter tariffs at varying rates of 15%, 25%, and 50% on a wide array of U.S. goods.
Wow.
We're talking steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, electronics, cosmetics, and even toilet paper.
But they didn't just pick items out of a hat. There was a very specific logic to what they targeted. First, they targeted goods produced in key U.S. political swing states. They wanted the governors and senators in those states to feel the pain and pressure the White House.
Right.
But secondly, and this is brilliant, they focused on products where Canadian businesses could easily substitute the U.S. import with an alternative.
That concept of substitutability is the key to a successful retaliatory tariff. The goal of a retaliatory tariff isn't actually to collect revenue at the border, it's to inflict economic pain on the exporting nation to force them to change their policy.
Right, because if Canada slaps a 50% tariff on a highly specialized U.S. medical device, and Canadian hospitals have no other choice but to buy that specific device, then the tariff just hurts Canadian hospitals. The U.S. exporter doesn't care, they still make the sale.
Exactly. But if Canada places a 50% tariff on U.S. toilet paper or standard steel, Canadian buyers simply switch their orders to European suppliers, or they buy from domestic Canadian mills.
Yeah.
The U.S. exporter doesn't just face a tax, they lose the market share entirely. The demand simply evaporates.
And beyond substitutability, these counter tariffs expose just how ridiculously integrated the North American supply chain really is. The seafood industry example is my favorite part of the research because it perfectly highlights the chaos.
Oh, absolutely.
The U.S. imports $4.3 billion in seafood from Canada, but the U.S. exports $881 million back to Canada for processing.
It's a logistical Ouroboros. You literally have fish being caught in one country, crossing the border, getting hit with a tariff, getting filleted and packaged in the other country, crossing the border again, and getting hit with another tariff.
It's crazy.
It creates immediate, chaotic bottlenecks that harm the U.S. processing industry just as much as the Canadian fishing industry.
And the retaliation escalated beyond just the federal government. We saw incredible aggression at the provincial level. Ontario Premier Doug Ford reacted to the tariffs by threatening a 25% surcharge on energy exports to the U.S. And he even floated the idea of cutting off power entirely to places like Michigan and New York. Let me push back on this a bit, though. Shutting off the lights in Michigan. The power grid is incredibly integrated. If Ontario cuts power to New York, doesn't that cascade and risk blackouts in Canada, too? Is this just Doug Ford doing political posturing for his base, or is this a genuine economic siege tactic that Canada would actually deploy?
Well, it's a bit of both, but we should view it through the lens of a calculated sovereign resistance strategy.
Okay.
Ford knows that actually cutting the power would be mutually assured destruction for the regional grid. However, by putting it on the table, Canada is moving beyond simply matching tariff lines on a spreadsheet.
Right.
They are actively identifying vulnerabilities in the U.S. infrastructure and threatening to exploit them. It sends a clear signal that economic coercion goes both ways. Canada is a smaller economy, but it controls critical inputs like energy and water that major U.S. states rely on to function.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because in any trade war, no matter how calculated the strategy is, there are going to be casualties on the ground. Downstream businesses go under, workers lose jobs, the cost of living spikes.
Always.
But the way these two governments are treating their respective economic casualties is a study in complete ideological contrast.
It really is a fascinating divergence in political economy. On the U.S. side, despite the data showing the loss of those 89,000 manufacturing jobs due to the input-output multiplier, there is a distinct void in the federal response.
Yeah.
The Trump administration has largely viewed the tariffs as the solution itself, and therefore has not provided widespread federal assistance packages for the workers and downstream businesses displaced by the chaos.
But then you look at Canada, and they rolled out a massive, unprecedented safety net. They announced a $7.5 billion CAD support package, which is in addition to $25 billion they had previously announced when the tensions first started.
And that money is being deployed very tactically. We're talking about expanded employment insurance extensions, ensuring that laid-off workers can survive longer while supply chains reorganize.
Right.
They are handing out $3 million in non-repayable loans and $2 million in interest-free loans, specifically designed to keep small businesses afloat while their input costs stabilize.
Wow.
And perhaps most importantly, they allocated over $500 million strictly for worker retraining in industries directly hit by the tariffs.
They also fundamentally altered their domestic market rules. They implemented a new Buy Canadian policy for federal procurement. They mandated that all federal construction and defense contracts, and they lowered the threshold for this to just $5 million, must be domestically sourced.
Right.
But let me play devil's advocate here. If the Canadian government mandates that everything must be bought domestically, aren't they just artificially generating domestic demand? Doesn't that risk massive internal inflation?
It does, yes.
You're essentially forcing the government to overpay for goods just because they have a maple leaf on them. Are they just printing money and throwing it at the problem to hide the agonizing pain of the trade war from their voters? Because, I mean, if the citizens don't feel the pain, Prime Minister Carney has way more political runway to keep fighting.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your cynicism is actually correct, but it's a feature, not a bug.
Okay.
The $7.5 billion package and the procurement rules are not just economic charity, they are a strategic buffer. Carney's administration knows full well that enduring a trade war with a neighboring economy that is 10 times your size is going to cause immense domestic pain.
Right.
The goal of this spending isn't to create a perfectly efficient, inflation-free market right now. The goal is to buy time.
Buy time for what, though? Treating the symptom without curing the disease eventually bankrupts the patient.
Exactly. And that is why this support net is merely a bridge to Canada as actual Plan A, which is permanent structural diversification away from the United States.
Oh, I see.
They are cushioning the blow so the economy doesn't collapse while they frantically rewire the entire country's export model.
Okay, so let's look at this rewiring, because buying time is useless if you don't actually have a viable plan. To execute this permanent diversification, Canada has to overcome a massive, fundamental economic law. It's known as the gravity model of trade.
Right. The gravity model is one of the most robust empirical findings in international economics. It dictates that the volume of trade between two nations is primarily determined by two factors: their economic size, their mass, and the geographic distance between them.
Meaning, you naturally trade the most with the giant rich guy who lives right next door.
Exactly.
Because the U.S. economy is so incredibly massive, and because it shares the longest undefended direct land border in the world with Canada, it exerts an immense gravitational pull. Historically, this gravity meant that roughly 75% of all Canadian exports went directly south. Why bother figuring out how to ship lumber to Germany when you can just put it on a truck and drive it to Detroit in 3 hours?
The gravity made it cheap, efficient, and deeply profitable. But to break that gravity, Canada now has to overcome massive friction.
Right.
They have to overcome the literal physical costs of shipping physical goods halfway across the world. But more importantly, they have to overcome what trade economists call dark costs.
I love that term, dark costs. It sounds nefarious, but it's actually just about bureaucratic friction.
Exactly. Dark costs aren't about fuel prices or the cost of shipping containers. They are the regulatory and cultural friction of doing business somewhere new.
Okay.
It's the cost of dealing with unfamiliar legal systems. It's the risk of operating without established business networks. It's the time it takes to overcome trust deficits in new markets where buyers don't know your brand.
So how is Canada supposed to defy gravity when shipping wheat to Indonesia is physically, legally, and culturally so much harder than selling it to Ohio?
By launching a massive state-backed infrastructure and diplomatic campaign to artificially lower both the physical and the dark costs.
Wow.
To address the physical costs, the government established the Trade Diversification Corridor Fund. This is a $5 billion fund, expanding to $10 billion, specifically allocated to build deep-water megaports and new rail corridors.
Okay.
The sole purpose is to ensure Canadian goods can physically bypass the U.S. logistics network entirely and load directly onto ships bound for Europe and Asia.
And domestically, this crisis finally forced them to address their own internal dysfunction. Historically, Canada had ridiculous interprovincial trade barriers. The paperwork required to do business across provincial lines was absurd.
Oh, yeah.
The data points out that it used to be easier legally to ship cheese from Quebec to France than it was to ship it from Quebec to Alberta.
It was a massive drag on their own GDP. But the existential threat of the U.S. trade war finally provided the political capital to knock those internal barriers down.
Right.
The provinces agreed to internal deregulation, effectively building a unified, hyper-efficient domestic fortress economy before they look outward.
And when they look outward, they are moving aggressively to address those dark costs. They have set an incredibly ambitious diplomatic target of securing immediate market access to 3 billion consumers globally. And the speed at which they are executing this is staggering. International trade deals usually take a decade to negotiate. Canada is doing it in months.
It's diplomatic whiplash. The strategy is to establish legal frameworks so Canadian businesses have zero dark costs when they enter these new markets.
Let's run through these rapid-fire trade deals because it proves how serious this middle power decoupling really is. They just signed a major deal with Indonesia. This is Canada's first bilateral deal with an ASEAN nation. And it doesn't just cover agricultural commodities like wheat and potash. It includes a defense pact.
Right.
They concluded a comprehensive free trade agreement with the United Arab Emirates in a record 47 days. 47 days.
That's unheard of.
They signed a deal with Ecuador, and they struck the Safe Security Partnership with the European Union.
The EU deal is particularly interesting because it isn't just about moving goods, it's about deep technological integration. That safe partnership actually secured lucrative European defense contracts for a Montreal-based company called Marconi Technologies.
And they aren't stopping. They are actively in deep negotiations with India, the Mercosur bloc in South America, and the broader ASEAN bloc in Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
And the early results of this frantic rewiring are already showing up in the macroeconomic data. Canadian exports to non-U.S. markets were already up 11.1% in 2025.
Which is a huge shift.
It really reminds me of a freelancer who gets 90% of their income from one massive corporate client. For years, it's comfortable. You don't have to market yourself. You don't have to network. But it's secretly incredibly dangerous. When that single corporate client suddenly undergoes a leadership change, becomes toxic, starts demanding you lower your rates, and tries to dictate who else you can work for, it forces a terrifying, painful separation. Your income tanks initially.
But ultimately, it triggers a healthy, necessary glow-up.
Exactly. You are forced to hustle. You build a website, you network, you diversify your portfolio of clients. And a year later, you might be working harder, but you are infinitely more resilient because no single client can ever threaten to bankrupt you again.
That is an excellent analogy for middle power decoupling. Carney is using this crisis to prove a much larger geopolitical thesis, that middle power countries, nations that aren't superpowers but have advanced economies, do not have to submit to the economic coercion of their massive neighbors.
Right.
If a middle power is willing to endure short-term friction, heavily subsidize the transition, and invest in structural diversification, they can rewrite the rules of their own economic dependence.
But wait, I want to push back on the physical reality of this. Shipping wheat to Indonesia, exporting aluminum to Europe, building deep-water ports, all of this still involves boats, shipping containers, and physical gravity. And you can still put a tariff on a shipping container. But there is a piece of data in the State of Trade 2026 report that completely flips the script. It reveals a secret weapon in Canada's arsenal where the concept of gravity barely exists at all.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most vital component of Canada's long-term resilience strategy. The report reveals the massive rise of the services economy.
Okay.
We are talking about digital consulting, software engineering, artificial intelligence research, financial services, and higher education. The data shows that services now make up nearly a quarter of Canada's total exports.
And here is the stat that really stopped me in my tracks. Services have been the sole driver of Canada's $50 billion in export gains since 2022.
Yeah.
Physical goods exports have been flat or declining. The physical stuff isn't driving the growth, it's the invisible stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And crucially for the context of this specific trade war, the services sector is already largely decoupled from the United States. Only about 50% of Canada's service exports go to the U.S., compared to over 70% of their physical goods. The service sector is inherently globalized.
So how did they build this invisible fortress?
The report highlights three foundational pillars. First, human capital. You need a highly educated, highly skilled workforce to export AI research. Second, digital integration. You need the physical infrastructure, the massive server farms, cloud capacity, and data centers to host and transmit these services. And third, strong regulatory environments.
That third pillar is vital. Canada aggressively leveraged modern multilateral trade agreements like the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Right.
These modern agreements contain specific e-commerce provisions that explicitly prohibit countries from applying customs duties on electronic transmissions.
Wow.
Furthermore, they ban forced data localization, which means a country can't force a Canadian software company to build a server in their country just to do business there. It creates a completely frictionless global environment to sell a digital product instantly. But let's look at the human cost of this transition. If you are a blue-collar worker in a lumber mill in British Columbia, and you lose your job because the U.S. slapped a 50% tariff on softwood lumber, you can't just wake up the next morning and become an AI software engineer in the services economy.
No, absolutely not.
There is a massive skills gap. Isn't this transition inherently going to leave the working class behind?
What's fascinating here is how the Canadian government's response attempts to bridge that exact gap.
Okay.
That is why the $500 million worker retraining fund we discussed earlier is so critical.
Ah, right.
The services economy isn't just coders, it's logistics management, digital administration, and advanced manufacturing oversight. But you are right to point out the friction. A transition like this is generational, and it won't be seamless. However, at a macroeconomic level, digital services act as an incredible national shock absorber.
Because you can't exactly station a Border Patrol agent in the cloud.
No, you can't.
You can't slab a physical 50% tariff on a consulting Zoom call or a piece of proprietary software code in the same way you can hold up a freight train full of steel at the border. The physical mechanisms of a 1930s tariff law just don't apply to a 2020s digital export.
Precisely. The services sector allows Canada to continue generating immense wealth, bringing in foreign capital and maintaining high-paying domestic jobs largely outside the physical reach of U.S. border agents and traditional protectionist tools.
Okay, we have covered an incredible amount of ground today. We started by looking at a sudden, shocking diplomatic breakdown over national sovereignty, where Canada firmly refused to let the U.S. dictate its global relationships or its domestic cultural policies. We examined the self-inflicted wounds of the U.S. tariff policy, exploring how the input-output multiplier guarantees that trying to protect one primary manufacturing job often ends up destroying 60 downstream jobs, driving up inflation for everyday consumers.
We also analyzed Canada's surgical, dollar-for-dollar retaliation, specifically targeting substitutable goods in swing states, and how they built a massive $7.5 billion domestic support net to cushion the blow for their own citizens, which is a stark contrast to the U.S. approach.
And finally, we saw how Canada is attempting to permanently escape the gravitational pull of the U.S. economy. They are doing it by rushing through rapid-fire trade deals to reach 3 billion global consumers and heavily leaning into a frictionless, tariff-resistant digital services economy.
It really emphasizes that true economic literacy in the modern world isn't just about knowing who placed a tariff or reading a political tweet. It's about understanding the complex ripple effects. It's understanding the input-output multiplier, the gravity model of trade, and recognizing that modern supply chains are so deeply integrated that a weaponized tariff often acts more like a boomerang than a shield.
And that brings us back to our neighborhood metaphor to close things out. The U.S. tried to build a 50-foot concrete wall to dictate the property lines and control who their neighbor could talk to. But instead of submitting to that pressure, Canada just built a helipad in the backyard and started flying over the wall to do business with the rest of the town.
That's a great way to put it.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought. If Canada as forced middle power decoupling actually succeeds, if they can thrive without relying on the superpower next door, could this spell the end of the post-WWII geographic trading blocks?
Wow.
If proximity no longer dictates prosperity, thanks to digital services and diversified deep-water megaports, are we witnessing the beginning of an era where economic superpowers can simply no longer use geography to hold their smaller neighbors hostage? Something to mull over until next time.